The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above the ICU at Oak Creek Memorial, a sound Ashley Cooper had learned to tune out years ago, somewhere between Fallujah and a field hospital that no longer existed on any map. She moved through the ward at 0600, her steps soundless on polished floors that smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, the particular silence of people learning to breathe around machines. Her scrubs were the color of pale blue water, unremarkable, the kind that made her invisible in hallways where everyone wore the same uniform. That was fine. She preferred invisible. Bed 12 had a new patient. An Air Force colonel, mid-30s, stable vitals, but something guarded in the way he watched the ceiling, as if the tiles might crack open and swallow him whole. The chart noted military protocol, no visitors, restricted access, 2 security details rotating 8-hour shifts outside his door. Ashley didn't ask questions about that. She had learned long ago that some silences were more important than answers. She checked his vitals without announcement, her fingertips finding the radial pulse with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory deeper than nursing school. 78 beats per minute. Slightly irregular. She registered the irregularity before the cardiac monitor caught it, a full 3 seconds before the screen updated with the same information her hands had already known. Her body angled between the patient and the hallway as she worked, shielding each movement, each for adjustment, each careful notation in his chart. The movements weren't paranoid. They were just old. They were just automatic. A small scar ran along her left forearm, visible only if you looked when her sleeve rode up. It was the color of old bone, the kind that had been cut clean and stitched by someone who knew how to minimize the scar tissue. Most people didn't notice it. The ones who did usually asked if she'd been in an accident. She never answered. Accidents implied randomness, and nothing about that scar was random. She hung the fresh for bag, normal saline, 0.9%, the safest choice for a patient with cardiac irregularity, and checked the drip rate against the monitor. Everything moved at the right speed. Everything was in its place. The colonel's eyes tracked her hands, and she felt the weight of his attention but didn't meet it. There was recognition in that attention, maybe, or just the standard wariness of a man whose body no longer answered to his commands. Ashley understood both. The nurse station was quiet. Shift change hadn't fully dissolved yet, the night shift giving way to day shift in that delicate 30-minute window when the hospital belonged to no one. She refilled her coffee in the break room, using the stainless steel coffee pot as a mirror, watching the distortion of the fluorescent lights reflected back at her. Her face was steady, the kind of steady that came from practice, from years of holding expression like a held breath. Brown eyes. Dark hair pulled back so tight it pulled the skin at her temples. Hands that were calloused in specific places, the soft part of her palms, the inside of her middle finger from gripping syringes, her left index and thumb from holding the plunger of a syringe for long enough to memorize the weight. That was when she heard Dr. Marcus Sterling's voice cut through the quiet of the break room like a scalpel through silk. "I'm giving the new one a week," Sterling said to no one in particular, though Ashley knew he was speaking directly to her, using the assumption of empty rooms the way certain men used power, as if it belonged to them by default. Quiet nurses never last. They can't handle the pressure. No backbone. No, he paused, letting the silence finish the sentence. Ashley poured her coffee, the dark liquid hitting the ceramic mug with a soft splash that was louder than it should have been. Ambition. Sterling stood in the doorway in his pristine white coat, the kind that was never actually worn in patient care, the kind kept for appearances and authority. His watch was a Rolex, gold band catching the overhead lights like he'd positioned his wrist specifically to achieve the reflection. His wedding ring matched. He was handsome in the way that money and regular Botox injections could manufacture, his jawline probably sharp enough to cut himself on, though the softness at his neck suggested the sharpness was all bought and none of it was real. A week, he continued, speaking to a resident who had followed him into the break room and was now staring at his shoes. Maximum. She'll realize she's out of her depth and request a transfer. They always do. Can't stand being in a room with someone who actually has credentials. Ashley poured cream into her coffee. 1 splash. 2. The cream spiraled through the dark liquid like smoke through air, and she watched it swirl, this small physics equation playing out in a ceramic mug while a man she'd never met tried to calculate the exact moment she would break. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the resident. She didn't let anything show on her face except the simple, blank attention of someone thinking about whether she preferred the break room coffee or the one from the machine in the ICU. The trembling he was waiting for never came. Her hands held steady around the mug. Her voice, when she used it, came out exactly as quiet as he'd predicted, which was exactly how she wanted him to hear it. "Excuse me," she said, not to him, but to the space between them, moving past him with a kind of deliberate not touching that was its own form of response. "Sorry." The apology was automatic, polite, the exact kind of deference he was counting on. It was also, by design, devoid of any actual contrition. It was the word sorry as performed by someone who had nothing to be sorry for and never would, which was entirely different from an apology delivered with actual regret. Behind her, she heard Sterling turn back to the resident. "See? No spine. She apologizes for existing in a room. A week. 2 at most." Ashley moved through the ICU with the coffee in one hand and a blood pressure cuff in the other. The heart monitor beeped in steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical complaint, and a call light blinked red above bed 4. She checked on her assigned patients with hands that had trained in field hospitals where hesitation cost lives, where you learn to move with absolute certainty because the alternative was someone's child bleeding out on a steel table while you stood there trying to figure out your next move. The precision of her movements wasn't born from textbooks. It was born from Tikrit, from a transport vehicle that caught fire at 0247 in the morning, from a moment when the only thing between alive and dead was knowing exactly where to cut to relieve an airway that was closing, knowing exactly how hard to press on a sternum that was already broken, knowing exactly how long you had before the brain damage became irreversible. Field hospitals didn't give you time to think. They just gave you bodies and the knowledge that you either saved them or explained their death to someone who loved them. Civilian nursing was a different kind of work, slower, more technical, more bound by protocol and hierarchy. But her hands didn't know the difference. Her hands just knew how to work. By 0800, the morning shift was fully engaged, the ICU filling with the organized chaos of 12 critical patients all requiring attention simultaneously. Ashley was assigned to 3 beds, including the colonel in 12. She moved between them in a pattern that was economical, efficient, the kind of movement that suggested someone who had once been responsible for more patients in worse conditions and was therefore incapable of being flustered by any normal Tuesday morning. That was when Dr. Sterling made his circuit through the ICU, white coat trailing behind him like a cape that nobody had asked for. He stopped at each bed, issued observations and orders in a tone that made clear that this was his domain, that he was doing all of them a favor by showing up, that their continued employment depended on his assessment of their competence. When he reached the colonel's bed, he looked at the chart, looked at the monitors, and then looked at Ashley with the kind of expression that suggested he'd found something that displeased him. "Adjusted his for rate without consulting me." Sterling's voice had that particular edge to it, the one that suggested he was looking for grounds to find fault. The 4 rate was perfect. It was also, apparently, evidence of overreach. Ashley's response came quiet and even, the kind of tone you used when you knew you were right and were willing to let the evidence speak for itself instead of wasting energy on argument. Irregular rhythm on the EKG. Rate of 120 irregular. Slowed the saline to prevent fluid overload and cardiac stress. "I see." Sterling studied her for a moment, and she could feel him trying to construct a reason to object, trying to find the angle where her competence could be reframed as insubordination. "Well, in the future, consult with me before making changes to the treatment plan." "It's protocol." It wasn't protocol. They both knew it wasn't protocol. Protocol was that nursing staff could adjust for rates within established parameters, which she had. But protocol didn't matter as much as the fact that Dr. Marcus Sterling needed to establish who was in charge in his hospital, and he had decided that this quiet nurse with her steady hands and her absolute refusal to be flustered was somehow a threat to that established order. Ashley nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Understood, Doctor. Sterling moved to the next bed, already starting to explain to his trailing resident why the previous nurse had been incompetent in ways both numerous and obvious. Ashley watched him go, then turned back to the Colonel, who was looking at her with something in his eyes that might have been recognition or might have been just the simple fact of having seen someone stand quiet and competent in front of a man trying to diminish them. She checked his monitors. The irregular rhythm was still there, still requiring attention, still manageable. Pain was information. She had learned that in places where there was no time for pain management because you were too busy managing the trauma underneath it. Every irregularity was data. Every small deviation from normal was the body trying to tell you something if you were quiet enough to listen. The morning stretched forward, full of small tasks and steady work. By noon, Ashley had settled into the rhythm of the day, the way the ICU breathed and pulsed with its own life. Sterling passed through one more time, made one more comment about the importance of chain of command, and then disappeared toward the administrative offices where apparently his actual work happened, whatever that work might be. It was around 1,400 hours when Ashley's fingers brushed against the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she always wore regardless of the uniform on top. It was a small gesture, unconscious, the kind of thing you did when you needed to remind yourself of something that nobody else could see. The patch had been part of her for 20 years, stitched in by someone she had served within a time and place that had been officially erased, officially nullified, officially made into something that never happened. But it had happened. And the proof of it was sitting in bed 12, still guarded, still recovering, still watched over by 2 security details and a nurse whose hands never trembled, whose voice never cracked, whose competence was so absolute that it made doctors nervous because they weren't used to being in rooms where they weren't the most dangerous person present. Sterling would try to break her. That was clear. But he had no idea who he was trying to break, which was exactly how she preferred to operate. The mask was perfect. The uniform was exactly like everyone else's. And the truth was sitting in a pocket close to her heart, stitched in with thread that had seen Tikrit and everything that came after. What happened next would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. The staff lounge at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and ambition that had gone rancid. Sterling stood near the window at 0730, his voice carrying through the open door where Ashley refilled her mug from the communal pot, its glass carafe stained with the residue of 1,000 rushed mornings. "I'll give the new girl a week," he announced to the cluster of residents orbiting him like planets caught in his gravity. His laugh was the sound of a man who'd never been told no. 10 to 1 she's crying in her car by Friday. Any takers? Laughter rippled through the room, the kind that required no wit, only compliance. Ashley's hand steadied on the coffee pot. One measured breath. She poured, walked past the open door without acknowledging she'd heard, and kept her eyes on the corridor ahead. The tears wouldn't come until later, and even then, only when no one was watching. 2 days crawled past like hours in a waiting room. The morning rounds took them through the cafeteria where Ashley balanced her breakfast tray, oatmeal, black coffee, and apple arranged with the precision of someone used to eating in vehicles or standing up, as Sterling approached with his residents trailing behind him in surgical blue. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly institutional glow. She saw him coming before he moved. His jaw was set in that particular expression of a man about to perform cruelty for an audience. "Excuse me, doctor," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him pass. Sterling didn't step past. He smiled, made direct eye contact, and swung his elbow into the tray's edge with the casual violence of someone who'd learned that small violations went unchecked. The tray crashed to the tile with a sound like broken promises. Oatmeal exploded across her shoes. Coffee spread in a dark pool that reflected the overhead lights like a mirror to something broken. The cafeteria went silent, that particular silence that happens when witnesses realize they're watching a line get crossed and none of them have the spine to say so. Sterling didn't apologize. He didn't even break stride. His resident stepped carefully around the mess, their eyes anywhere but on her face. Ashley knelt. Her hands picked up the scattered debris, the tray, the bowl, the spoon. She moved with the economical grace of someone who'd cleaned up far worse in places where the mess was still breathing. A single tear escaped down her cheek, unbidden and immediate, but her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist without breaking her forward gaze, without acknowledging that anyone was watching. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this," she said to no one in particular, her voice steady as a cardiac rhythm that refuses to flatline. She stood, balanced the tray, and walked back toward the sink. Behind her, one of the residents whispered something to another. Neither of them was laughing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came on day 6. Sterling reviewed charts outside the colonel's room with 2 residents positioned like props in a scene designed to prove his authority. Ashley approached with medication, the colonel's ordered antibiotics in her hand, charts organized and ready. Sterling pulled the chart from her hands before she could present it, not took, pulled, and threw it at her feet. The paper scattered across the tile like autumn leaves blown by contempt. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he sneered, his voice coated in the particular venom reserved for people he'd decided didn't matter. "And next time, wait until a real medical professional reviews the orders." The resident stared at their shoes. The colonel watched from his bed, his face darkening in a way that suggested his rank, though he didn't speak. Ashley stood motionless for 1 full second. Her chest rose with one measured breath. One tear escaped, not the desperate crying of someone broken, but the involuntary response of a body processing humiliation it refused to acknowledge. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. The deferential nurse was gone. What emerged was something older, something that had survived things Sterling's entire career was built on never facing. "I've picked up better men than you off worse floors than this, doctor." The resident's eyes snapped up. Sterling's smile froze on his face like a video paused mid-frame. The colonel's hand moved to his call button, not to summon help, but as though the gesture itself was a salute. Ashley turned to face her patient directly, turned her back to Sterling completely, and checked the colonel's vitals with hands that moved like they'd performed this task 10,000 times before. Her voice, when she spoke to the colonel, was gentle again. "How's your pain level, sir?" The colonel didn't answer immediately. He just watched her with the peculiar intensity of someone seeing something he'd thought was lost materialize in front of him. Sterling walked away. His residents followed, their conversation sparse and uncertain. The humiliation had backfired. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of someone broken, but the silence of witnesses realizing they'd been watching the wrong person bend. The attack came 4 days later at 0214 on a Tuesday, during that particular dead zone of morning when the ICU was quietest, when the night shift nurses worked with the focused intensity of people trying to keep the temporary permanence of life support functioning. Ashley checked the colonel's vitals, BP 118/72, heart rate steady, rhythm regular, the exact opposite of what would come next. She was adjusting his for flow when she heard the stairwell door bang open, that particular sound of metal hitting metal, wrong for the quiet of the unit at this hour. No visitor badge announced itself. No staff credentials were scanned. The man who appeared in the colonel's doorway moved with the predatory precision of someone who'd rehearsed this, dark clothes, face partially obscured, his right hand emerging from his jacket with a tactical knife that caught the monitor's green glow and threw it back like a promise of blood. Ashley's body didn't ask permission from her conscious mind. 20 years of muscle memory took over. She stepped between the blade and the colonel's bed with the fluid motion of apex predators protecting territory. The knife came in fast, aimed for the colonel's throat, and she deflected with her forearm while her other hand moved to trap the attacker's wrist. The first stab caught her left shoulder, a burning line of fire that radiated through her deltoid as she continued the motion, using his own momentum against him. The second stab was meant to be the killing blow, but she'd already shifted her weight, and it punched into her right side below the ribs instead, a deeper wound, the kind that made breathing complicated. The knife fell. Her hands executed a joint lock that should have belonged to a SEAL team operative, not an ICU nurse, and the intruder's radius snapped with an audible crack that echoed in the small room. He screamed, the sound of panic and broken bone mixing into something primal, and ran back toward the stairwell. She heard his footsteps diminish down 3 flights of stairs. Ashley staggers against the colonel's bed. Blood bloomed through her scrubs, soaking the fabric, warm and immediate. But her eyes locked on his monitor. The rhythm had changed. The pressure was dropping. The waveform flattened in a pattern she recognized from field hospitals in Tikrit, from a surgical tent in Sanjan Valley, from the exact moment before someone stops breathing. Cardiac tamponade, she manages into the call button, her voice already thready, already giving up oxygen it needed. Fluid in pericardial sac. Needs immediate pericardiocentesis. Now. Her vision grayed at the edges. The room tilted sideways like a ship listing in heavy seas. Her knees buckled, and the world went dark before she hit the floor. The trauma team found her 10 minutes later, unconscious, bleeding from 2 stab wounds that the colonel had applied pressure to with his own hand and his call button. They performed the life-saving needle decompression she diagnosed with her final conscious words, the 18-gauge angiocath inserted at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the hiss of air and fluid escaping as the pressure relieved and the colonel's heart began beating without the weight of blood crushing it. She'd saved him twice that night, once with her body, once with her voice. But as the anesthesiologists worked on her own wounds, as they ran her blood type and prepped for surgery, no one knew what would happen next. No one knew that the phone calls were already being made, that Sterling was already activating his network, that the very people who should have celebrated her heroism were about to destroy her. They had no idea that 3 days later, everything would change again, and this time, the cavalry would arrive in force. The stairwell door banged open at 2:14 a.m. Ashley heard it from the medication alcove 3 rooms down, that particular sound of metal on metal that belonged to nobody on the night shift, the timing all wrong for the cathedral silence of the ICU. She didn't stop drawing up the colonel's morning cardiac panel. Her hands finished the task. Syringe capped. Vial returned to the medication refrigerator. The motion looked routine, but her shoulders had already tightened into the posture that required no thought, only training. The colonel's monitor showed sinus rhythm at 68 beats per minute. Blood pressure stable at 118/74. O2 sat holding steady at 97% on 2 liters. 48 hours since the initial trauma, and his body was healing with the discipline of a man built to survive worse. Ashley had watched the ventilator come off yesterday. She'd listened to his lungs inflate with his own breath, expanding like a second chance he'd already proved he deserved. She turned toward his room. The footsteps came too fast, not the measured pace of a nurse doing rounds, not the shuffled urgency of a code team. These steps belonged to someone running on adrenaline and desperation, the kind of gait that came just before everything changed forever. Ashley moved into the colonel's doorway. The man who burst through the window-facing door had a knife that caught the lead alarm clock light. Not large. Not decorative. A serrated utility blade maybe 6 inches from hilt to point, the kind that came from a hardware store shelf and could open veins with the same efficiency it opened drywall. His eyes had the quality of pupils dilated beyond pharmaceutical help, either pure rage or pure chemistry. Ashley couldn't afford to waste the cognitive processing to decide which. He wore a grey hoodie and a level of certainty that suggested someone had paid him very specific money to be here. "Out of the way, nurse," he said. His voice sounded like gravel in a blender. Ashley did not step back. She stood in the doorway exactly where she had been standing, her posture unchanged, her hands visible at her sides. The part of her brain that had spent 20 years in uniform recognized the tactical situation immediately. He expected compliance or panic. He expected her to run. He expected the moment to break into screaming and chaos and the 3 seconds of confusion that would let him do what he came to do. Instead, he got silence. "I said move." "Colonel's in septic shock," she said quietly. "His pressures can't handle the stress response. You hurt him, he bleeds out faster than any knife." It wasn't remotely true. The colonel's vitals were stable as granite. But her voice carried the absolute authority of someone stating medical fact, and for 1/2 second the man's eyes flickered with uncertainty, that tiny gap between intention and execution where the weight of unexpected resistance could shift a decision. He closed the gap by 3 feet. Fast. Decisive. The knife raised in the deliberate arc that meant he'd done this before. Ashley moved. The shift came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Her hands intercepted his wrist at the apex of the knife arc. The motion bent his arm at an angle that nature had not designed human joints to bend. Her body rotated, a single fluid sequence of hip-to-shoulder mechanics, and his forward momentum became her leverage. The knife fell. He fell after it. But not far enough, and not fast enough. His other arm came around her torso, and the impact of his body into hers drove her toward the colonel's bed. She felt the blade separate from his grip and clatter somewhere against tile. She also felt the new blade, the one he'd kept in his other pocket, slide across her left shoulder with the sensation of ice water and then fire. Pain was information. Pain was data. Ashley's hands moved on muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than the lie of her last 7 years. She had him in a chokehold that a SEAL Team 3 instructor had taught her in 2003. She applied pressure to the carotid artery with the anatomical precision that comes from knowing exactly how many seconds it takes to make a man unconscious. For seconds. But he had already twisted. He had already brought the knife up again. It found her ribs on the right side, between the 5th and 6th intercostal spaces, and for one moment the only sound in the room was her breath catching. Not from pain. From the knowledge that a blade in that location could hit the liver. The kidney. Could compromise her ability to keep breathing if it went deep enough. She didn't let go. Her left hand moved to his wrist, the knife hand, and applied pressure in the direction his thumb wasn't designed to move. He screamed. The blade dropped. His grip released. The choke hold intensified for 3 more seconds, and then she released him before he actually lost consciousness. She needed him alert enough to answer questions. She needed him to understand that he had chosen the wrong room. He dropped to his knees on the polished hospital floor, gasping like a fish. Ashley stepped over him. Blood soaked through her scrub top on the left side and down her right flank. She could feel it cooling against her skin, the stickiness of it, the smell of copper and iron that no amount of hospital sterility could ever fully bleach away. She moved to the colonel's bedside with the gait of someone for whom pain was just another environmental factor requiring no special accommodation. His monitor showed the first sign of change. The blood pressure was dropping. 84/52. 80/48. The heart rate had elevated to 118, compensation for whatever was happening inside his chest cavity. Ashley read the electrical rhythm on his monitor with the precision that came from 10,000 hours of watching dying men, and she saw it immediately. The voltage was dropping, the waveform flattening. His ventricular function was compromised. Pericardial fluid. Blood between the heart wall and the pericardium. The cardiac tamponade. The attacker's blade hadn't touched the colonel at all. But the trauma of the attack itself, the chaos, the adrenaline, the stress response, had triggered something inside the colonel's healing body that had begun to bleed into the space around his heart. A few milliliters would be fine. 50 milliliters could be fatal. She was watching the moment where the fluid crossed that threshold. Code Blue, ICU, she said into the intercom with the precision of someone who had done this before. She didn't raise her voice. Raised voices were for amateurs. Authority was in the timber. Cardiac tamponade, room 318. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Get me an ultrasound. Get me now. Her hand had already moved to the colonel's chest. She could palpate his ribs like reading Braille, counting down to the landmark. The space between the 5th and the 6th rib. The mid-axillary line. She had done this procedure twice in the field hospital in Tikrit, once in 2004, once in 2005, and the body didn't forget what the mind wasn't allowed to remember. The trauma team hit the room like a controlled explosion. Dr. Helena Chen, the night shift trauma surgeon who had actually done her residency in somewhere that taught her how to save lives instead of just how to look good doing it, arrived with a portable ultrasound already in her hands. 2 residents. A respiratory tech. A blood bank courier with full units of O negative. Pericardiocentesis, Ashley said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. Apical approach. He's in tamponade. Dr. Chen looked at the monitor. Looked at the Colonel's pale face. Looked at Ashley and saw the blood for the first time, noticed it like a punch to the jaw, the volume of it, the distribution of it that made it clear the blood had come from somewhere very specific. Get her a trauma room, Chen said without looking away from the Colonel. Now. But first. Needle goes in between ribs 5 and 6, mid-axillary line, angled toward the shoulder, Ashley continued. Her hands were beginning to feel distant now, the way they did when the blood loss crossed into the range where the brain started rationing blood flow to non-essential functions. 60 milliliters minimum before he stabilizes. Watch the pressure. When you hit the fluid, you'll feel. Her knees bent without her permission. Her hand reached out to the rail of the Colonel's bed, not for balance, but for something to hold onto. Something that mattered. Something that had survived. The room tilted. The fluorescent lights blurred. She tried to say something else, something about the pericardial catheter, about the way the fluid would drain like dark honey out of the needle hub, about the exact sequence of vitals that would follow. Her mouth didn't cooperate anymore. She was aware of falling. She was aware of hands catching her. She was aware of Dr. Chen's voice saying something urgent about blood loss and fours and getting a trauma surgeon down here right now. She was aware that she had done the thing that mattered. The Colonel's chest was where it needed to be. The team was moving with the precision that meant they had understood the diagnosis. They would run the needle in. They would pull the fluid. They would save his life with the knowledge she had purchased with her own body. Then there was darkness. The last thing her conscious mind did was catalogue the Colonel's vital signs from his monitor before the unconsciousness took her. His heart rate was dropping, his blood pressure rising back toward something survivable. The electrical rhythm was strengthening. The pericardial fluid was decompressing his heart with every milliliter Dr. Chen withdrew through that needle. He was going to live. Ashley had made sure of it. And then there was nothing but the sound of the trauma team working around her, the steady beep of her own monitor being attached, the hiss of saline flowing into lines, the organized chaos of a hospital fighting death with every tool it had been given. Somewhere in that darkness, the Colonel's blood pressure rose to 92/58. The cardiac rhythm stabilized. The threat passed. But Ashley was already gone, slipping away into the gray space where pain stopped being information and became only memory, only the fading echo of a woman who had spent her entire life saving everyone else and had finally paid the price. The monitor above her bed beeped every 3 seconds. 72 beats. Steady. The same rhythm she'd been hearing for 18 hours, ever since she woke in room for 12 with bandages wrapped so tight around her shoulder and ribs that breathing felt like negotiating with broken glass. Pain medication coursed through her for line, something strong enough to sand the edges off reality but not enough to erase what had happened. The shoulder throbbed in waves. The stab wound to her side burned with each inhale, a hot wire pulled tight beneath the surgical tape. Ashley stared at the ceiling tile above her, counting the acoustical perforations like someone solving a puzzle that had no answer. 144 holes in perfect rows. She'd counted them 3 times already. A hospital security officer knocked at 0800, stepping into the room with a tablet and the kind of careful expression people wore when they knew they were about to hurt someone. His name tag read Paulson. He was maybe 30, with the careful posture of someone who'd never been hit but spent his days thinking about it. "Corporal," he said, reading from something on his screen before catching himself. "I mean, Miss Cooper. I need to ask you some questions about the incident in room 318. Are you up for this?" Ashley nodded without speaking. The pain medication made her mouth feel like cotton. "Okay. Walk me through what happened. Starting at 2 a.m. when you heard the alarm." She recounted it all in flat clinical language. The sound of breaking glass. The shadow moving toward the Colonel's bed. The moment she calculated angles and speed and probability and chose to move anyway. Paulson typed, his stylus scratching against the tablet screen in the silence between her sentences. She told him about the knife, the cold metal she felt the instant before pain registered as information. About her hands moving through disarmament sequences her body remembered even though her mind had spent 20 years trying to forget they existed. About collapsing against the colonel's bed and seeing the monitor reading telling her what she already knew: pericardial effusion, tamponade developing, need immediate needle decompression. You diagnosed cardiac tamponade from a monitor reading while you were being stabbed. Paulson's stylus stopped moving. Yes. And you disarmed him. The intruder. Yes. How did you know how to do that? Ashley turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes. The medication made everything feel distant, observed from some high balcony above her own body. I've had training. Paulson wrote something. Then he wrote something else. Then he closed the tablet. Okay. We're going to need a full statement for the police report. But I wanted to tell you, you saved his life. The colonel. The trauma team says if you hadn't called for the pericardiocentesis, if you hadn't diagnosed it exactly right, he'd have been dead in minutes. You did that while stabbed. While losing blood. That takes. He paused, looking for the word. That takes something. It was my job. The security officer left. The monitors continued their 3-second rhythm. 2 hours later, the hospital administrator appeared with an HR representative. Dr. Linda Reeves, the administrator, had kind eyes that had learned to deliver bad news gently. She pulled a chair beside Ashley's bed and sat, which immediately told her everything. We need to talk about what happens next, Reeves said. The police investigation is ongoing. They're processing the scene. But we've also initiated our own internal review into the incident. Ashley waited. Specifically, we're reviewing the force you used against the intruder. Hospital policy requires that we assess whether your response was proportional and necessary, or whether it exceeded what the situation demanded. There it was. The blade drop, swift and precise. Not the attack. Not the colonel bleeding out. Not her collapsed on the floor with knife wounds throbbing through her ribs. The force she used to stop a man with a weapon from killing a patient. The review will take approximately 2 weeks, Reeves continued, her tone unchanged, diplomatic. During that time, you're being placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately. You're not to return to the hospital or access any patient information. Your badge access will be disabled. Hospital security will need to escort you from the building to collect your personal effects. I understand. You'll receive your full pay during the review period. And we do want you to know that your actions were heroic. Truly. But we have policies, and we have to follow them. I'm sure you understand. Ashley understood that the hospital was protecting itself. That somewhere in the building, Dr. Sterling was making phone calls. That the investigation into her had already begun long before any knife came through that window. The escort was a young man named Decker, not the kind who would normally be assigned to security details. He walked 3 steps behind her as she moved through the corridors in a borrowed hospital wheelchair. Her side wound made walking distances difficult, and the pain medication turned standing into a negotiation with gravity. Other nurses stared as she passed. Some looked away quickly. Others met her eyes for a half-second longer, a gesture too small to be defined as support but too deliberate to be accidental. Nobody spoke. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and the peculiar sterile emptiness of daytime hospitals. Her locker was on the 3rd floor. 3 items inside: a spare pair of compression socks, a granola bar from 2022, and the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, black and gold, depicting an eagle with wings spread, the kind of insignia that meant everything or nothing depending on who was looking at it. She tucked it deep into her pocket, feeling its weight settle against her hip like an anchor. Decker wheeled her to the parking lot. The San Diego sun was harsh and bright, the kind that made you remember you were alive. The car ride to her apartment took 17 minutes. Nobody was waiting for her there. Nobody had known to come. 3 days later, Ashley sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital in downtown San Diego, surrounded by men and women in various states of healing. A Marine with a prosthetic leg glanced at her bandages and nodded, a gesture of recognition, acknowledgement of a shared language. An Army vet offered her his seat without speaking. She took it. Around her, the afternoon ticked forward with the kind of numbing slowness that only waiting rooms could achieve. The television in the corner played news with no sound, captions rolling past like they were being typed by someone with no sense of urgency. The pain medication had given way to over-the-counter ibuprofen that barely made a dent. Her shoulder throbbed in a steady rhythm that had become almost meditative. The stab wound to her ribs was healing faster than the social collapse around it. By next week, the physical wounds would be mostly resolved. The suspension would still have 11 days remaining. The investigation would still be pending. Dr. Sterling would still be making calls. A woman in army dress uniform sat down beside her, waited 3 seconds, then said quietly, "They're treating you wrong." Ashley didn't answer. "I can see it. The way you hold yourself. The way your eyes move. You know how to move like that because someone taught you. And nobody teaches civilians to move like that." The woman extended her hand. "Captain Diana Holloway. I was attached to Joint Special Operations Command until 2015. I recognize the training when I see it." Ashley shook her hand but didn't confirm anything. The veteran understood. She just nodded and went back to reading her magazine. That was the one thing about being around military personnel, they didn't need the full explanation. They could read the subtext in posture and silence. Her phone buzzed at 12:47. A text from an unknown number, a street address and a time. Nothing else. Just coordinates and a timestamp. She almost deleted it. Then she recognized the area code, 702. Nellis Air Force Base. Her thumb hovered over the delete button for 7 seconds. Then she pocketed the phone. Meanwhile, 34 blocks away, Dr. Sterling sat in his office with the hospital's board chairman, Dr. Lawrence Chen, a man who owed him significant favors from an incident involving a botched surgery and a settlement agreement that never became public. Sterling laid out the narrative carefully. Ashley Cooper had shown signs of instability. Her response to the incident had been excessive. Her background check had been incomplete. There were gaps in her employment history that suggested she might have falsified credentials. "I'm not saying she isn't a good nurse," Sterling said, the words careful as a surgeon's incision. "I'm just saying we have a duty of care to our patients and our staff. And I think the board would want to know that we hired someone whose background we never fully verified." Chen listened. Then he made phone calls to 3 hospital administrators in other systems where Ashley had worked. Each time, Sterling's name came up with insinuation but no accusation, which was exactly the technique required. By evening, Sterling had engaged a private investigator with instructions to examine Ashley's employment gap, the missing years, the absence of digital footprint between 2001 and 2016. The investigator called back within hours. "It's like she didn't exist before 2016, he reported. No tax records, no addresses, no social media, nothing. It's either sophisticated erasure or a complete fabrication." Sterling smiled, hung up the phone, and began drafting the termination paperwork himself. Falsified credentials. Dangerous conduct. Excessive force. The board would have no choice but to terminate her immediately, pending the investigation's final outcome. He didn't know that the FBI had already traced the hired intruder's phone records. He didn't know that federal agents were following the money backward through shell companies and encrypted payment channels. He didn't know that every phone call he'd made in the last 48 hours had been recorded by equipment he didn't know was there, in his office, in the boardroom, in the hallway outside the cafeteria. The net was closing. Ashley's phone buzzed again. Another text, this one with a name, Colonel Morrison. She closed her eyes. The 6-year-old from Tikrit, the one she'd pulled from the burning transport with rounds snapping past her head. The one who'd grown up to wear eagles on his shoulder. The one she'd thought was dead for sure when the blade came toward his bed, because you don't get second chances like that. You don't get to save the same person twice. She typed back, "I'm here." 3 words. That's all it took to change everything. The Air Force arrived on day 3, but not to Oak Creek Memorial. They came to the board meeting Sterling had orchestrated, the one meant to bury Ashley Cooper under a mountain of institutional silence. The conference room on the 14th floor fell into that particular quiet that comes before everything changes, the kind of silence that sounds like a held breath before a detonation. The colonel walked in first, still pale from his brush with death but standing with the bearing of a man who'd commanded soldiers in Fallujah, his uniform crisp as broken glass, his presence moving through the room like cold water. Behind him came 3 officers in dress blues, 2 FBI agents in dark suits, and a naval commander whose face carried the weight of 23 years in the field. The board chairman's pen clattered to the table. Sterling's jaw tightened. He'd calculated so many scenarios, but not this one. Never this one. "Gentlemen," the colonel said, his voice steady as a heartbeat, "that Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper." He handed Ashley a file across the table, a manila, unremarkable on the surface, but when she opened it, her own face looked back at her from 2 decades ago. Younger. In uniform. Cradling a 6-year-old boy pulled from a burning transport in Tikrit, his small hands wrapped around her neck, her eyes fixed forward with the kind of determination that came from knowing you were the only thing standing between a child and fire. The photograph was dated August 2003. Ashley's breath caught, not trembling, not failing, just catching, because that boy was standing in this room now, decorated and alive and declaring her identity in front of the people who'd tried to erase her. The board members stared at the image, then at Ashley, then at the colonel, understanding crystallizing across their faces. "I was 6 years old," the colonel continued, his voice carrying the weight of rank, "when this woman threw herself between me and a burning fuselage. I was 42 when she did it again, 3 days ago, with a knife instead of fire." The naval commander stepped forward, SEAL Team 3 call sign Hammer, his shoulders moving with the fluid precision of a man who'd operated in denied areas across 3 continents. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper served with distinction in my command, Loga Province, 2009 through 2011, leading combat operations with a casualty rate 30% below theater average because she didn't leave people behind." His voice was granite. "Bronze Star for Valor." The board chairman's face paled as the first medal landed. "Silver Star for the Sanjin Valley Extraction, 2010, that's 19 Marines brought home because she walked into a structure every tactical assessment said would kill her." Another pause. "The second silver medal." And the Navy Cross, awarded for the Bagram operation in 2011, where she personally carried for wounded operators across 700 meters of open ground under sustained fire. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. "For Purple Hearts," Hammer said, his voice dropping low like artillery in the distance. "She has 4 Purple Hearts, which means she was wounded for separate times and came back to the line for separate times." He placed a folder on the table, military decorations, citations, photographs of a woman in desert camouflage leading teams, carrying wounded, standing with soldiers who'd survived because she knew how to control hemorrhage and chaos simultaneously. "We didn't know she was here," Hammer said, looking directly at Sterling. "We didn't know our sister had become a ghost in a hospital until she saved the colonel's life 3 nights ago with hands that remembered every combat protocol ever taught to her." The FBI agent moved with the unhurried confidence of someone holding the keys to a cell. "We finished our investigation into the attack on the colonel's room." He pulled out a laptop, opened a file, and the boardroom's atmosphere shifted from shock to ice. At 2:14 a.m. on the night of the stabbing, an armed intruder breached ICU security using a keycard and room information only accessible through the hospital's internal system. That intruder was hired, funded, and supported by Dr. Marcus Sterling to eliminate a witness, the colonel, who was scheduled to give a deposition in 4 days regarding a surgical error Sterling committed in 2019 that resulted in the death of Captain James Holbrook, a decorated junior officer. The agent clicked through images, Sterling's phone records, encrypted messages, financial transfers. Sterling received $200,000 from a private malpractice attorney in exchange for the elimination. The attorney needed the colonel's silence before testimony that would have exposed Sterling's falsified records, destroyed witnesses, and implicated 3 senior surgeons in the cover-up. The board chairman's face had gone the color of old bone. Security footage shows Dr. Sterling personally disabling the ICU camera outside room 318 at 1:33 a.m., 31 minutes before the attack. He provided the intruder with shift schedules, security blind spots, and the specific location of the patient. The agent clicked again. Bank records. Shell companies. A burner phone registered to Sterling's girlfriend's address. 16 calls placed at irregular intervals on the night of the attack. When the attack failed and the intruder was apprehended, Dr. Sterling shifted strategy to discredit the witness, Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper, by attempting to access federal military databases and fabricate a dishonorable discharge in her service record. This triggered automated alerts at the Pentagon and created a federal offense, unauthorized access to classified systems. 2 FBI agents moved to Sterling's sides with the inevitability of gravity. Sterling's face had gone from professional to panicked, his jaw clenching and unclenching, his hands gripping the table edge hard enough to turn his knuckles white. "You can't do this," he said, his voice cracking like old ice. "I'm a physician. I'm the attending surgeon. I have standing here." The FBI agent's response was delivered in a flat, final tone that sounded like a closing door. "You're a criminal who tried to murder a decorated military officer and destroy a war hero to cover your malpractice." The cuffs came out, stainless steel, clicking together with the precision of a surgical instrument locking into place. Sterling's resistance was reflexive, useless, the movements of a man suddenly understanding that his network had evaporated, that the board members he'd called were already on phone calls with their attorneys, that his private investigator was cooperating with federal authorities to avoid charges himself. The perp walk through Oak Creek Memorial's lobby went the way Sterling's life had gone, from private dignity to public catastrophe in the space between heartbeats. The hallway fell silent as security escorted them through, nurses pausing mid-documentation, residents pressing against walls like they'd learned to do, a patient in a wheelchair watching with the expression of someone who'd just seen the invisible made visible. Sterling's medical license was stripped 48 hours later. Federal charges were filed. The private attorney was arrested the same afternoon at his office in La Jolla. The conspiracy unraveled the way all carefully constructed lies eventually do, not suddenly, but inevitably, like a building designed to fail at exactly the pressure point no one thought would ever be tested. 6 months later, Ashley drove through San Diego on her way to work, taking the surface streets through neighborhoods that hadn't changed while everything else in her life had become official again. She passed a strip mall near the hospital, the kind of place where people went when their former lives had become impossible, and there he was. Sterling at a folding table outside a nail salon, wearing a polo shirt with an insurance company logo stitched over the heart, stacks of brochures weighted down against the ocean breeze with a plastic rock and a coffee can. His face was unshaven. His posture had collapsed inward the way people collapse when they've been hollowed out. When their eyes met through her windshield, his gaze slid away first. Ashley didn't slow down. She continued through the light and turned onto the road that led to the VA Medical Center, where a new brass nameplate beside a corner office read, Chief of Trauma Services, SCPO Ashley Cooper, USN, RET. The faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining hung framed on her office wall now, beside her Navy Cross citation and a photograph of a 6-year-old boy being carried from a burning transport in Tikrit by a young medic whose face showed the kind of purpose that transcends age. Colonel Morrison stopped by at 0800, fully recovered, bringing coffee from the cafe downstairs and updates on the legal aftermath. Sterling had pled guilty to avoid trial, 15 years federal prison, eligible for parole in 10. The junior officer's family finally received the accountability they'd waited for. Ashley accepted the coffee and reviewed her morning patient list, 12 combat veterans, 3 with injuries that matched memories, 2 with chest wounds requiring the exact procedure she'd taught to every surgeon in the building. Her hands didn't tremble. Her records were restored, her rank acknowledged, her existence transformed from carefully constructed fiction to earned reality. A young Navy corpsman knocked hesitantly at her door around 10:30, fresh from field medicine school, asking for advice on trauma protocols under sustained pressure. Ashley recognized something in his eyes, the hunger to know how to save lives when lives were slipping through your fingers like water, and she'd seen that same hunger in her own mirror 23 years ago. She invited him in and showed him the simulation model, walked him through the mental architecture of making decisions at 0200 hours when every second cost blood. Before her first surgery of the day, Ashley touched the framed unit patch the way she used to touch it hidden in her jacket lining, a ritual of remembering who she was beneath the scrubs and the silence. The Colonel caught the gesture from the doorway and smiled. "What you told Sterling that day," he said, "about picking up better men off worse floors, that stayed with me." Ashley pulled on her surgical gloves with the precision that comes from muscle memory deeper than medical school, from decades of doing the thing that mattered when no one was watching. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," she said. He never understood that. She walked into an operating room where a Marine with a gunshot wound to the chest waited on the table, his monitors beeping their urgent rhythm, his blood pressure dropping with each passing minute. Ashley's hands moved into position as if they'd never left this work, as if she'd never been invisible, and she began the surgical approach that would bring him home. Behind her, the door closed on a narrative that had finally, after 20 years of careful erasure, become true again. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength overcoming arrogance, and let us know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?